We're rolling?
Yes.
You got to give me a rolling signal. Just we're rolling. We are going. We are doing it. We are doing a talk show. Do you understand me? Welcome to the Magic Box Talk Show here in sunny, sexy, superficial Santa Cruz, California, next to the beach. A beautiful place. There's a roller coaster here. It's true. We have a roller coaster in this town. And so you should come visit, and if you like to have fun, you should come to the Fun City store, because that's what we're all about right here at Fun City. Woo! Yay!
Hey, cheers for Fun City.
Let's hear 3 cheers for Fun City, for he is a jolly good fellow. So, what is the question, Dennis, that we ask a lot of questions on this show, many varied varieties of them, but what's our favorite question?
Well, the favorite question is, what's in the box?
What's in the box? Yay! What's in the magic box today? It looks like we have Ascent to Civilization. Now, this is a book about a topic that Professor Dennis Etler, who's sitting before us today, happens to know quite a bit about, which is how it is that humans came to be humans. Now, Dennis, I have my Aunt Carol was told by Pat Robertson that this magic fairy dust was sprinkled and something like that. So, what is it that modern science actually knows about human evolution, and also in your question talk about how is it that we can say this with certitude, with a sense of having proof as to what's going on this planet.
You can believe your ears in terms of what Pat Robinson or whatever the hell
Pat Robertson, yeah.
Whatever he has to tell you, I mean, that's hearsay.
He's a televangelist guy. Aunt Carol, he's a con artist.
Right.
Look out for him, really.
Right. So that's hearsay. That's just a tall tale.
Yeah.
And then, so you can believe what you hear, or you can believe what you see with your own eyes, okay? And as you can see with your eyes there,
look at all the pretty pictures in this book. It's very well illustrated.
Right, fossils.
What are fossils, Dennis? Where do they find them? In the ground?
Fossils are the petrified remains of bone.
We can just look at the ground and tell what happened there before? That's amazing.
Yes, we can. And we have many fossil remains of our ancestors.
What are some recent discoveries that have been made? There's been recent advances in our filling in the quote-unquote missing links of the evolutionary theory. What can you tell me about that?
Well, there's constantly new finds being made on a continuous basis. Oh, the new remains that have been found in South Africa, East Africa, and China, and really all over the place. Mostly the earlier periods are in Africa, and later on in the rest of Eurasia and whatnot. So it's just an ongoing process of discovery, and there's just so much to talk about that we have to sort of focus in on.
Oh no, particular question. Okay, well, let's talk about the relationship between the humans and the Neanderthals. We know that these two different species existed on the planet simultaneously one time, or at least hominid ancestors of humans existed at the same time as
Neanderthals are fully human. There's no question about that.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, no, some regard them as a distinct species within the genus that we're within, Homo neanderthalensis, and of course, modern humans, Homo sapiens, as I'm sure we'll
It's really just a subjective question of classification.
Well, it's, there's many criteria that have been established to distinguish species from one another. Generally speaking, that's based on living organisms, whether or not they can interbreed successfully. And there's growing evidence, genetic evidence, because we can recover ancient DNA from Neanderthals, and we've actually sequenced the Neanderthal genome.
Now, explain what a genome is to somebody who's not a science expert.
The genome is the entire genetic makeup of an organism. Each and every one of us have our individual genomes, well, within each and every one of our cells, within the nucleus, all the genetic material housed on our chromosomes.
So there's different type of molecules that repeat in different combinations that spell out a code, which the cells use to build proteins.
The genetic code, and just to cut to the chase, we have our own individual genomes, but all humans are so similar that we can speak of a human genome. So
what's the relationship between the Neanderthal DNA and the human DNA?
It's virtually identical. I mean, we can distinguish certain variants, genetic variants that distinguish.
How close is the Neanderthal variants to the chimpanzee variants?
We're equidistant from the chimpanzee. Neanderthals and modern humans are equally distant from the chimpanzee because we share a more recent common ancestor. Based on genetic analysis, it's estimated that the common ancestor that we share with Neanderthals, which would have been an archaic human, lived about 400,000 years ago. So that's not all that, distant a relative. The common ancestor we share with chimpanzees, both Neanderthals and modern humans, would be more than 6 million years old. And Neanderthals and ourselves only 400,000. So you can gauge for yourself how closely we're related to Neanderthals relative to, say, the living apes. So Neanderthals are human in all respects.
Mm-hmm. So, at what point do scientists consider the modern species of humans to really originate? Does that kind of start with Homo erectus when humans start walking upright?
There again, we got to get our terminology straight.
Right.
Modern humans, we belong to the species Homo sapiens. That's what we refer to as anatomically modern humans. People like you and I, that spread throughout the world. And the earliest evidence of anatomically modern humans in the fossil records about 160 to 200,000 years ago, and that's pretty consistent with the genetic evidence for the population from which all modern living people are derived.
Okay. Who's Lucy?
Okay, now Lucy's going much further back in time. Lucy's about 3.2 million years ago. Lucy is what we refer to as an Australopithecine. This is a much earlier ancestor, sometimes referred to as a man-ape, or a proto-hominid, or something along those lines. Not fully human in the sense of the term that we generally apply. It had many ape-like features in terms of its brain size. It had a brain no larger than that of a living ape. And other, very, very ancestral-like features, but it did walk upright. It walked on two legs. It's what we refer to as a biped.
So in terms of the timeline, I mean, one of the other sort of distinguishing characteristics of modern humans is like tool use and the kind of ability to manufacture culture. At what point, so the humans start walking upright and then they start using tools? Like what's the earliest tool find compared to that on the timeline?
The earliest recognizable tools in the archaeological record go back around 2.5 million years, and that's about the time when our genus, the genus Homo, appears in the fossil record. So that seems to be when what you might call humans, in the sense of the word that we're familiar with, really come on stage. About
Excellent.
2.5 million years ago. Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis. So this has all been very fascinating and academic. Let's switch tracks, and we are going to talk about China now, which is another topic of which you are well renowned.
Yeah, well, I've done most of my research in human evolution in China over the last 30 years or so, and have traveled extensively there, speak the language, and I've traveled extensively throughout the country and keep abreast of everything that's going on there. So, sure, I'd love to talk about China.
Okay, let's go for it. What are some of the things that Americans who've never visited China that you would want them to understand about China that maybe they have a misperception of, or?
Well, yeah. Well, we have pretty much a total misconception of what's going on in China. What we see happening in China now is basically they picked up where they left off. Back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, China was still a great power, but it was a power that was basically isolated from the rest of the world. And China had closed itself off back in the Ming Dynasty, back in the late 1400s, early 1500s. They thought that they were totally self-sufficient. They really didn't need to have any sort of relationships with the rest of the world.
Because they're the Middle Kingdom and they're the middle of the world,
Kingdom.
right?
Now, prior to that, they were engaged. They sent out vast armadas to sail the seas, and some people even suggest that they circumnavigated the globe, even though there's not all that great evidence for it. But there were these vast armadas that the Chinese court had sent out under the command of southern Chinese Muslim eunuch by the name of Zheng He. He was an admiral of the Imperial Fleet, and he commanded armada of what are known as treasure ships, these 20-mast junks that were as large as aircraft carriers. And I kid you not, these are massive sailing vessels, and they plied the Indian Ocean, and traded with the sultans and potentates of South and Southeast Asia, and made their way to the Arab Arabian Sea and up and down the coast of East Africa. And you can still find porcelains that the Chinese traded for raw materials in East Africa, littering the coastline of Kenya and Tanzania.
So what's going on today in modern China?
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is that China was once, a world power when Europe was still sort of a backwater. But then they gave it all up. They decided, it was, they were just spending too much money, and there was really no need to, continue on in that vein. And they
trying to conquer the rest of the world.
They scuttled their fleets and basically became more or less a hermit kingdom. Until the West began, in the 15 and 1600s, sending their fleets, to open up the Spice Islands and the trade routes to the east. But it wasn't until the late 1700s, early 1800s, that China went into eclipse, and the Western powers really, began to exert control and influence. And then there was about 100-year, interregnum, when China really declined and was subject to, colonial, sort of control by the West, and the country just began to disintegrate. Of course, you got the emergence of the modern industrial economy, and China just wasn't prepared to integrate into this new emerging capitalist world economy. So what we see now, since the establishment of independent sovereign China, with the revolution that occurred after the war, after World War II, China has basically reestablished itself as a fully, unified, integral, nation, and basically picking up where it left off. So that's the one thing we have to understand. Forget about the ideology. Of course, it's important, but China has to be seen as basically reassuming its rightful place in the world, one that it's had, for millennia. So it's really just picking up where it left off.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So when you're talking picking up, you mean really economic is a big part of that. The economy.
Oh yeah, China always led the world economically. Back in the late 1700s, the GDP, the gross domestic product, as calculated now in hindsight, China and India combined had about 2/3 of world GDP. So now they're basically reassuming the position they had prior to the expansion of Western colonialism. So it's really going back to, where they had been. So what we're seeing now is the world basically, turning back to where it was a couple of hundred years ago.
So, what do you think is the future of China? Like, what direction is China going in?
Well, I think it's basically, like I say, it's assuming its rightful place.
Yeah, okay.
And it's going to continue to do so, and it's probably going to be the leading civilization in the 21st century and later. I mean, it's a very ancient civilization, and they have a wealth of, experience, history.
A really
to fall back on.
Complex culture. I think the way that the writing is in pictograms is a perfect example of the degree of sophistication of culture that's been attained in China.
Culture. I've been studying Chinese and Chinese culture. You can come from China, as many people do, and immediately, particularly if you're young, in your teens or early 20s, you can immediately become acculturated. You can absorb American culture in a summer. You go to China as a foreigner.
Just watch the TV for a few days, and you've got it.
You go to China as a foreigner, you will never be acculturated into Chinese culture. It's just too complex. You have to be born into Chinese culture to be totally fluent in the Chinese language, or to be totally, conversant with all aspects of Chinese culture. You just can't
Absolutely.
do it.
Well, I mean, they've had so many years to develop so many different aspects of civilization, have knowledge about.
Our history is 200-300 years at most, and Chinese
we're a baby.
1,000 years.
We're a baby of a country, and I think that it's reflected in the lack of political maturity that exists in the United States.
Yeah, that's another thing. Chinese political culture again has a history of at least 2,000 years, back to the founding of the modern Chinese, empire, and the first Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huangdi about 240 BC. And basically, the contours of the way China is organized and ruled has changed very little till today. You can't understand China except through the prism of Chinese history and culture.
Absolutely, which is a lifetime study, really.
Yeah, I mean, and see, most
even for Chinese people,
most Westerners just have no idea what they're talking about. The one thing that's very interesting, of course, I've been going back and forth to China for decades now, and I read the same story still today in the press that, China's economy is about to collapse, or there's this crisis or that crisis. I've been reading this for 30 or 40 years now, and, they defy all of these naysayers year in, year out. So now, everybody's been talking about a hard landing for the Chinese economy, and I just read in today's paper that Chinese exports over the last year had risen by 10%, when everybody has been talking about how their economy is in the doldrums.
Well,
I wish our exports had risen by 10%.
We're currently sitting in a store that is just chock full of commodities that were manufactured in China. So, and that's an interesting historical question as to why is that? Why is there so little made in the USA products?
Well, we're
in the American economy in general.
American capitalists obviously are wanting to maximize their profit. They go where the labor is cheap. Now the thing is, cheap labor in China has to be seen
Race
within
to
a
the
Chinese
bottom.
context. I just read another article today that in the 30 years, since 1978. Per capita income in China has gone from 380 yuan, that's the Chinese dollar, to 29,000 yuan in 30 years. I mean, that is a 100-fold increase in per capita income.
They've had a real estate boom, they've had a factory boom, they've had a construction boom.
So incomes are still much lower in China than they are here. Wages are concomitantly lower as well, even though the minimum wage in China has gone up 20% a year for the last decade almost. But it's still
it's still relatively low wages compared to the U.S., right?
Of course, now what you're seeing in China is they're going to value-added production. So a lot of the cheap goods you're going to see are going to be coming from countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, And, what we're seeing from China now are value-added goods, the second tier. Just like what happened with Japan. You might remember in the 1950s, most of the Japanese goods were trinkets. It said made in Japan. It was no different than made in China, has been for the last couple of decades. But then what happened? We begin getting Sony Walkman, and then we got, TV sets.
Like, Japan developed its high-tech industry.
Yeah, well, that's what
really to a degree that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Yeah, well, China is doing, recapitulating that. They're going to value-added production, and so we're going to be seeing imports from China that are a higher quality and of a different sort than what we've been seeing previously.
I see. That's interesting. I mean, I suppose that's a positive development, and at least on the level that we'll be getting better goods.
Well, I've never had a problem with anything I bought from China myself. I don't know.
There you go.
Seems to be okay by me.
Yeah. So Dennis, what's an interesting period in China's history?
They're all pretty interesting.
Pick one and go with it.
Let's see. The Han Dynasty is fascinating because it's a period that in the West is the height of the Roman Empire. And the Han Dynasty, China and the Roman Empire were on a par in terms of their cultural and economic development. And there is growing evidence of direct contact between China and Rome, so that there were actually envoys from the Roman Empire who basically visited the Chinese court. So I think that would make a wonderful sort of, Hollywood production. You could have a joint production of, the Chinese.
Oh, you don't say a movie about China. Made with China Hollywood.
Oh, that would be great, because the Chinese.
Well, that's how Kill Bill, Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill series was made. Was with a Chinese production company.
Right. But what I'm thinking is a historic drama. Because the Chinese are great at recreating these, historic, scenes, from the different dynastic periods. And we're very good at recreating ancient Rome and all that. If you had the two, collaborating on some costume drama of, Romans and Chinese from the Han Dynasty going at it, that would be pretty exciting.
That would be interesting. Definitely a contrast between two starkly different cultures there.
Yeah, and they were, like I say, they were in contact. It's interesting because the silks, the togas that the Greeks and Romans wore, the silk came from China, and it was paid for by gold. And there was actually, some say that there was actually a balance of payments deficit with gold leaving Rome and going to China for silk, somewhat similar to what's been happening here in today's world. So.
Well, that's fascinating that the Romans were so dependent upon the Chinese.
Yeah. There's, like I say, some people suggest that it was one of the contributors to the decline of Rome was that so much of their gold was being siphoned off
went over to China. Wow.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Another interesting period in Chinese history is the Tang Dynasty, when China was in direct contact with much of the rest of the world. Particularly India, and other parts of Asia and the Arab world. From the Tang Dynasty through to the Mongol conquest, China was part of a global economy, a global community of nations, including India, the Arab world, and there was a vast trade network so that you could travel from the coast of Morocco, on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, clear across to the Pacific coast of eastern China, and many people did do that. And
the boats were kind of the superhighway of the ancient world.
Yeah.
It's supplanted by airline travel now.
Right.
But
so, Europe was always sort of a backwater, sort of totally out of the loop until the emergence of the Age of Discovery in the 1600s.
Okay, that's great. I think we're gonna go with that. That was excellent. That was wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's been good.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show, Professor Dennis Etler, talking about early human evolution and China. He's a professor at Cabrillo College here in Cabrillo is actually in Aptos, California, right down the street from Santa Cruz.